Hello, and welcome to my channel, The Independent Pianist. In honor of winter, and the first snowfall of the year, at least in Michigan where I am, today's video is of the lovely Snowflakes, or Snowflakes, by Palmgren. If you like this channel and you want to see it continue to grow week by week, please consider making a pledge at my Patreon page, www.patreon.com/independentpianist. Pledges help me to continue to bring you this content on a regular basis. Thank you very much. Also, if you're interested in honing your skills as a pianist, I also give online lessons to ambitious students, so just send me a message at cole@independentpianist.com. Palmgren was a very prolific composer among the next generation of Finnish composers after Jan Sibelius. In his day, he was most well known for his wonderful piano miniatures, although he also wrote some larger-scale works, including 5 quite lovely piano concerti. Nowadays, you unfortunately hear very little of his music. Of course, Palmgren came from a time when it was still quite common for performers and conductors to also be composers. In fact, most famous pianists in those days wrote at least some works for themselves, or made arrangements for. For example, there were people like Walter Gieseking and Wilhelm Backhaus. Wilhelm Kempff made a wonderful series of arrangements of Bach and other composers. Myra Hess has her famous arrangement of Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring, and many others also, like Ignaz Friedman and Vladimir Horowitz, wrote encore pieces for themselves. And that's accepting composers of great stature like Rachmaninoff, Prokofiev, Bartok, etc. In their day, they were almost equally famous as performers, even though now their legacy is primarily as composers. Throughout musical history, it's actually been common for performers and composers to be one and the same. Just about all the famous performers we know of from past centuries were also busy composers, and vice versa. This gradually became more and more rare in the 19th and 20th centuries, though, when it became more common to specialize as an executive musician rather than a multifaceted one. The reasons for this are many. Partly it has to do with the rising technical standards of performance, egged on, of course, by recordings, and especially by the advent of recordings on magnetic tape in the 1950s and onwards, which gradually allowed more and more precise editing and more blemish-free performances on recording. The kind of performances that you get on recordings like this are hard to reproduce under pressure in a concert hall unless you devote an enormous amount of time to maintaining and tweaking your pianistic mechanism. Obviously, this makes it harder and harder to continue with creative pursuits. You have to spend all your time practicing. Another reason was probably the growth of what is nowadays sometimes called classical canon. This idea of a kind of library of music which had proved by the test of time that it was valuable was really a notion that began to grow in the 19th century. And as this canon of music has expanded and grown, and as more and more composers have added to it over the years, it's become more difficult for the performing musician to really grasp this enormous repertoire. Of course, the idea of a classical canon is a little bit illusory, since it is actually difficult to agree on what should really belong to it. For example, should Schoenberg be in the classical canon? Or should Gershwin belong to the classical canon? It's difficult to actually pin these things down oftentimes. Nonetheless, the expectation that a great pianist, for example, should basically have at their fingers all the repertoire from Bach to Bartok is quite a substantial requirement, and that's no doubt been a contributing factor in the specialization of performers versus composers. Also, there is a certain anxiety of influence factor as well. The argument that you hear usually goes something like, well, I can write an effective piano piece, but my compositions are not going to be as good as Beethoven's or Mozart's, so why bother? I don't feel the need to compose like they probably did. And that's basically how Arthur Rubinstein put it in the first volume of his autobiography, for example. And my reply to that would be, well, you don't really know exactly what kind of pieces you're going to get unless you try writing them, and you don't know how much of an enthusiasm for composing you might develop until you really try developing your compositional style. I'm glad to see that this whole trend is changing a little nowadays, and we're seeing more and more performers in the classical realm who at least also dabble with composing. It's always seemed to me that the creative outlet is a very useful one for a musician, whether or not what you create becomes a classic, or even if you share it with anyone at all. It's still very beneficial for your understanding of music and your sense of completeness as a musician to include improvisation and composition in your activities. So back to Palmgren. Palmgren's musical language was obviously influenced strongly by the French Impressionists. You can see this in his use of unusual scales and modes and parallel chord structures, as well as in his harmonically ambiguous chord progressions. Still, in general, his musical language was a bit more conventional, if you compare it, for example, to the later works of Debussy. Unlike a composer like that, Palmgren more or less maintains the standard tonal structures, the outlines, tonic-dominant relationships, etc. He just blurs the edges, and he does this in really exquisite ways sometimes. His somewhat sentimental style finds a perfect expression in these kind of gorgeous miniatures that he was famous for. In this particular piece, he creates a really magical sense of floating by undermining the solidity of his tonal center, by structuring the right hand ostinato, this kind of repeating pattern in the right hand, as well as the melody as to make it ambiguous whether we are in A major or F sharp minor. And eventually we realize we're in F sharp minor. And this is a fairly standard key relationship in standard common practice era tonality. It's a minor key and it's related major, but the way that Palmgren makes this ambiguity is really unique. Instead of following a more standard practice like juxtaposing the two keys in completely different sections, instead he just constructs his melody in a way that at one moment seems to suggest one key, and then at another moment suggests another, and the accompaniment to that melody is already ambiguous by its very nature. And up until the very end of the piece, Palmgren really leaves us in uncertainty as to how it will be resolved. So this also brings us to the interesting question of miniatures versus larger works, because I think there's really a bias towards the larger works as being intrinsically more valuable and as demonstrating a composer's skill to a greater extent. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think a great composer of miniatures shouldn't be undervalued. It's actually a very difficult thing. The easiest way to think about it is probably thinking of great writers of short stories. Think of someone like Edgar Allan Poe or Ernest Hemingway or someone like that. You know, with very few words or very few notes, you have to really paint an incredibly vivid scene and draw your reader or your listener in. And that's what Palmgren really manages to do in this piece and in many of his other pieces. So it isn't fair to relegate him to the dustbin of history just because he didn't really write large-scale, complicated works. So please enjoy the performance, and stay tuned for more videos on this channel coming up. Leading up to the new year, I have some exciting repertoire planned. I'm going to have at least one more piece by Percy Grainger, and a really beautiful piece by Fanny Mendelssohn, which is almost never heard. And my big piece before the new year is Rachmaninoff's First Piano Concerto. So until next time, thank you for watching.